Hey everyone, welcome to the part two of this series that we had with Sam Spurlin. Just as a context for the convo, we went into how DAOs should be facilitating emergence, and that naturally goes into how tools like Discord and broader tools can allow for that sort of organizational cohesion within these DAOs. We also get into the broad aspects of how what are the lessons that were taken for from his time over at the Ready that could be applied for DAOs in general. We also discuss about the ideals of what a DAO should be, which he is not a fan of kind of setting it as a standard. But the key point that I think you listeners will enjoy is we dig into a lot about how DAOs should be digging into what an organizational canvas is and how the discussions around that could ease up a lot of the tensions within the DAO. So let's get into part two, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Sam, I just want to kind of understand, do you think that it might be a issue of having like a proper tool? So do you think Discord is like the best place to kind of have these structures like DAOs hosted? Or do you think we should come up with better tools? And how, if so, like what would be the tools that you think would be more optimal for having the DAO structures that you think are the best?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like it's a little bit of a trap because I could talk about like tool stuff. And we like for what people like talking about tools, obvious problems with them usually. We're interacting with them all the time. I mean, where my first thought goes, two separate thoughts. One is, of course, like tools play a huge impact on what it is like to do the work in an organization, whether we're talking about Discord, Slack, email, like whatever. The tools kind of constrain the potential actions that we can take. So of course they have a huge impact. Also, though, I very rarely will push on tools first because there are good and bad ways to use the tools that we already have. There are practices and principles that will allow Discord to be super helpful and great for us. And there are principles and practices that basically just turn Discord into a worse email. So maybe like often I will encourage organizations to start with whatever the tools they currently have and there's already habits around and see what sort of experimentation we can do to make this tool better for us. Because at least in my experience, if there's already a tool or a suite of tools that most people are using, getting people to shift to different ones, even if they hate the ones that they're currently using, is a huge uphill battle. So let's try to like create some practices and some agreements around how we'll use our current suite of tools, and then see how far we can get down the path. And often while we're doing that, there's maybe some experimentation happening around the edges with some other tools. And then I have seen occasionally, being able to actually jump to a tool that is better designed for like what we're trying to do. I mean, like for example, at the Ready, like we don't use email, at least not internally. So like I don't have any email with any of my colleagues. I do have it with my client organizations. And I have definitely worked on projects with client orgs where they have been trying to experiment with, what would it look like if we did something similar? What if we didn't have email? What if we were able to move our conversations to Slack or to Teams? And we've definitely like had some successful projects around that. But I don't know that we've ever like shifted an entire organization into that. But, the thing with traditional orgs is that they're primarily email based, and using some sort of other chat tool is a huge opportunity for them because, I mean, we could spend 10 minutes going back and forth about why email is not a great tool especially in a complex environment where you're having to talk with a lot of people. There's lots of ongoing threads of conversation, being able to structure that into topic-based channels. And even if we're not treating the chat tool synchronously, which I would argue we should not, we should treat Discord and Slack as an asynchronous tool. There's a huge opportunity there. For DAOs, we're already primarily in a chat tool, but there's definitely good and bad ways to use that. Have we really thought through what our channel structure is? Do we have agreements around when to expect someone to respond to something, things like that? That's where my head would go if I were helping a DAO think through some tooling stuff.
The way I see it, Discord in general, I think a lot of people put Discord is not perfect, okay? But at the same time, you take a look at the whole DAO space, 90% of DAOs use Discord. That means Discord must be working in some way if 90% of the entire space is using it, right? But clearly, there are issues within Discord also that kind of make it an issue. My question is, are we kind of putting a false onus on Discord when clearly it's a lack of documentation or a lack of understanding how your community is operating, and then just putting the blame on Discord? The way the whole system works is, okay, Discord is not perfect, but it does work very well in terms of facilitating async. Maybe a lot of context within most of these broader work streams itself could have been better shown also. But for that, are we like really putting the blame on Discord, or is it a kind of a lack of broader documentation that could have been supplemented with what you see with tools?
I got excited because as you were talking, I was like, oh, maybe what reorgs and structure changes are to traditional organizations, bitching about Discord is to DAOs, meaning that because Discord is where we experience a lot of the tensions, we think the problem is Discord, when really what we are experiencing within Discord is a lack of clarity around authority, or a lack of clarity about workflow, or a lack of clarity about information. And if we had some agreements around those things, we actually wouldn't have much of a problem with Discord. We're just kind of conflating the tensions that we're feeling with where we are feeling the tensions, if that makes sense.
That's a good way to put it. So briefly, you kind of mentioned that the ready is, so just want to kind of understand how is that structure different from a DAO, and what are the primary differences there?
So structurally, in some ways similar to a DAO. I think probably the easiest way is to talk through the ways that it is different. So we're not, we don't have a token or anything. So the owner of so Aaron, our founder, retains the vast majority of the equity in the organization. Early on, we were doing some interesting things around granting equity to people every year. And the ready would cover the tax burden and everything. But I don't understand the ins and outs of all of it, but the American legal structure doesn't make it easy to gift equity to your employees and not have it become like a huge tax burden for the organization. So we've paused that, and instead are doing like a much more generous profit share to try to like still let people participate in the upside of being at the ready, but not necessarily earning equity. Another thing is that we are definitely not permissionless. Like, it's hard as shit to get hired by the ready by design, because the work we do, at least up until now, we're kind of doing a little bit of some experimenting around some more specificity, but we're all like really skilled generalists. We are not necessarily like I don't have any colleagues who are like, I only do like this type of project, or I only do this type of project. The way that we work with organizations is that we kind of have to be able to do whatever shows up in the organization. So it makes it difficult to hire. But also, because we are self-managing, we want to make sure that the folks that are coming into our system, we have a really high level of trust with them. And if you've gone through our hiring process, then I don't have to worry about the fact that you have a company credit card and no rules basically on what you can spend money on. Like, because we have some shared expectations, we do actually have some rules around, $3,000 every 4 months you can spend in the Ready's purpose, or in pursuit of the Ready's purpose, no questions asked, like those sorts of things. But we are very, I was going to say unstructured. It's not that we're unstructured. It's that we are a very trusting environment, so that the membrane around becoming a member of the Ready is much, I think, thicker than it is for a lot of DAOs. But I mean, other than that, we have, our structure is kind of holacratic in that we have nested circles, and we have a governance process where if you are going to be affected by an agreement, you have the opportunity to consent to that agreement and help shape that agreement. Specifically consent, though, not consensus. We are not interested in getting to full consensus on everything because it's way too slow. And we are just now starting to experiment in the last year or so, because we've gotten large enough. Up until about a year ago, we kind of just did governance at a full company level all the time for everything. But now we are experimenting with roles that are representative roles. So there's a member representative who represents me at the source governance at that highest level. And then there are, within those nested circles, those circles do the governance related to the thing that they have been given the authority to do. So for example, we have a DAO circle within the Ready, actually within our transformation circle, which is kind of the circle that holds everybody who holds a role related to doing our consulting work. The DAO circle, Tanisi and I, and anyone else who is a member of that circle, we do governance around our workflow and whatever agreements we need specifically related to how we do DAO stuff. And that's true across the organization, our studio circle, our growth circle, things like that. And like I mentioned earlier, we use Murmur to both make those decisions and then have that be the central repository of where all those agreements live.
So I see a lot of parallels to what's going on within the DAOs, the sort of experimentation that you've done to kind of make the Ready kind of an efficient organization. A lot of it you're seeing within the DAO circles itself, the aspect of having some sort of delegates within the whole DAO circle and broader. You don't want to go for consensus because it's because it just gets too slow. You don't need another midterm cycle. Today itself is bad enough. Then the whole permission angle also, you want to keep it very strict also. But then you take a look at how DAOs in general kind of operate. There are these various themes, in which they want DAOs to be. I mean, as you mentioned, like the Ready is not permissionless. Okay, there's a strict standard for which once. There's a strict barrier to entry. You should be a capable candidate and you should fit the criteria, and then you're a part of the Ready. But once you're in the system, then you have a broad, trusted environment where you have that sort of ability to kind of take decisions, and you have that whole credit card system where there's no questions asked for a certain amount of money. There's so much freedom and that sort of decision given to you. But you take a look at DAOs, there's a lot of questions there. Should it be permissionless? Should we kind of have a permission system? Should there be that sort of exclusion or not? Should everybody make the decisions or not? But you take a look at DAOs and specifically decentralized autonomous organizations. From the definition itself, it's like the entire decision making and operations should be spread across, and it should be done without a certain person pulling the lever on it. It should be done in a central way. And that's all we know about it. But all the question about permissionless or, the aspect of how much should be that decentralization should be done, you tend to see all these certain organizations putting that central parameter that it should be this way, or you need to have the broader collective voting and all of that. Is it healthy for that sort of discourse to take place, or should it be like what is that the gray zone, the gray zone of what a DAO should be,
Yeah, I'm really hesitant to talk about what a DAO should or shouldn't be. I feel like that's just not. I haven't been in the space long enough to be kind of a voice of that. What I will say is that I think it's really dependent on what your DAO is there to do. I think, we often talk about DAOs as this kind of single entity, as if they are all the same. But look at 10 different DAOs and you will have 10 very different outcomes that they are trying to create in the world, whether it's just kind of like a group of friends trying to invest in stuff together, to like making really complex software, to literally anything. I have a hard time thinking that, given that variety of DAO purpose, that there is one answer to really almost any question. So I think I could very easily be convinced that DAOs should absolutely be permissionless, and also that DAOs should actually have kind of a less porous membrane around them. And I think it depends on what you're trying to do. I hold a personal opinion that I think the work that, Metropolis, formerly Orca, and others who are trying to think about what does it mean to have teams that have very specific focuses, what in the Ready we would call concentrated authority. What does that enable within a large organization? Because when you've got that, You don't have to worry about kind of the polling everybody or voting on everything across an entire organization. I mean, the Ready saw when we got to about 30 people, that was no longer like we couldn't do that anymore. So it definitely is not possible when you get into the hundreds or thousands of folks, I don't think, for most decisions at least. So I'm really curious to see DAOs experiment with using a consent-based process to give certain teams concentrated authority where they can run in a specific area and still retaining kind of that connection to the larger organization so that they can kind of be recalled or redirected if they're kind of going too far outside of that concentrated authority. But I think when you get lots of small teams with very clear concentrated authority working toward a common purpose or a common mission, that's where you start to get the interesting emergence, where you start to, I think, get the benefits of DAOs, which are those unexpected innovations that you can't get in a more hierarchical top-down organization.
I think you made a fantastic point there. It's like it's at that edge of what is kind of mission-oriented and kind of that the unexplored frontier of innovation. That's where you kind of see broader emergence happen. Just to kind of bring into example, we had Drake Danner, who was one of the key operators for Metrics DAO, essentially a broad community of people or data analysts per se within the Web3 ecosystem. They kind of look into different questions brought in by clients about certain analytical issues, and then they come out with solutions. And those questions are kind of put together in the form of bounties, which make it kind of a gamified ways for the broader analysts to just kind of come in and answer those questions. And the community, how they kind of made this a broader community where it became really cohesive was that they decided to have an educational on-ramp, which means they set in courses where if you were a beginner in this whole data science and assessing the whole data analytics aspect, you had a course that was done by these people, some of the top data analysts within Web3, and they would teach you everything about this whole thing, and it would be outcome oriented where eventually you would land jobs within that network. And essentially the funny thing was this was something that was totally unplanned, or most of them didn't have that expectation because everybody had this thing, oh man, it's education, man, this might be real tough. How do you execute this? And will you see that sort of broader, how do you put it, the positive outcomes that you see with that community cohesion? But when they structured it and when it came out, it turned out to be one of the most positive things for the community that you could see. And in that sense, the sort of emergence that came out of it was pretty lit that way. But you take a step back, and you talk about emergence in general. I mean, you see this being facilitated within these DAOs when they are big enough and when you're trying to create that sort of kinetic energy from a certain stagnation from their operations. But what about DAOs that are starting off? I mean, how DAOs kind of operate from early cycle to late stage. These structures are kind of very malleable. They kind of evolve according to the community itself. How do you see organizational design evolve for DAOs who are like at early stages? The way I see it, the DAOs just kind of pick up Discord. They have certain key operational roles set up. They have departments set up, and then they start to get rolling. What you don't see being done right from the early stage is that the structure that is necessary for them to grow. How do these workflows kind of operate? The action meetings, the structure that you see within these large DAOs, you don't see that being enabled from large DAOs within these early stage DAOs because they're still trying to get a feel of what's kind of working for them. And even if they did understand their purpose, they want to allow for the community to kind of dictate that. And it would just kind of be ignored. Are DAOs making a mistake ignoring the facilitation of an organizational design from the start, or should that be done only when there's like a broad critical mass of community?
Yeah, I'm actually of the belief that I don't think you should over structure or over optimize anything org design related early on. So I think it's totally fine for a DAO to just kind of do what it wants for a bit. And I think the key thing, though, is to pretty quickly get on that rhythm of retrospective and experimentation based on what is actually coming up. So I don't think, the way to start any organization, particularly a DAO, is to like necessarily like figure out your purpose and essential intent right up front. I mean, I think that's fine. If you're, that's already clear and like that's why you're convening people, then that's fine. But I don't think kind of going through and creating a bunch of structure in the hopes of, or the prediction that we're gonna need it, is actually the right move. I think the structure should be in response to actual tensions that are coming up along the way. I think the mistake that many organizations make is that they wait too long and then they feel like they have to make major changes in order to address the things that have come up. But if you're regularly, pausing and asking yourself what is going on within our org design right now, and are we okay with it? And the things that we're not okay with, can we figure out a way to experiment around that? As long as you're on that cadence, then I think you can't go too far astray. The problem is when you start something and you go a year just kind of doing stuff, and then you get to this breaking point where like, oh my God, there are some like really fundamental tensions here that I wish we had talked about earlier. That's when you start to get into the dangerous zone of feeling like your experiments have to be big. And the bigger your experiment is, the harder it is to pull off. And the less likely you are to do more experiments, because the experience of doing that experiment was so brutal that you're just like, I don't want to go through that again. But I think the pattern, or what you're looking for, is, can we just make experimentation around our org design just part of how we do work? Like, it's not anything special. It's like every month we have one or two things that we're playing with and we're learning from it, and we're either pivoting away from them or scaling them up based on how things are going. I definitely don't want to be the voice, and I'm sometimes sensitive to making sure that I'm not, of like, you got to have it all figured out. You got to do your structure. You got to have action meetings. You got to do this. You got to do that. I don't actually think you have to do anything until you've actually started to feel the problems of not having a thing.
But then the issue is, as you mentioned, I mean, I agree that, to some extent you gotta you gotta have some sort of serendipity. You gotta let the community flow, and then you just kind of set that structures in place. But then what happens is that the problem that you mentioned is they take too long to figure out that there's a real problem. How do you start assessing them? Should DAOs? But the problem is, when it becomes too big of an issue, then you kind of bring in that sort of solutions to stop it. It's like, I forget the name of the movie. John Cleese, one character, also, he says when the world is kind of going to end, he says that when every time in history, you see mankind kind of face a rapid issue that may kind of break down mankind in general, it's only at the precipice of that moment that mankind will find solutions to kind of change that. And it's only at that moment it turns out to be a win. My question is, why do you need to wait that long? Why do organizations get to that point? Why do DAOs get to that point where the communities, it becomes kind of a problem? How do you kind of allow for assessing when tensions are, when do you start bringing in that sort of solutions when tensions are okay rather than becoming a big problem? How do you bring in that sort of assessments?
Yeah, I think we get to that point because unless you are a super nerd about org design stuff like me or my colleagues or you guys as you're interviewing me about org design stuff, or probably the folks who would listen to a podcast like this, I have to constantly remind myself that most people don't give a shit about this. They don't. They're in an organization to do the work of the organization, to do their job. They're working they're not working on the organization, they're working in the organization. And sometimes I lose track of the fact that not everybody is thinking about the org design stuff. So I think it's very easy to just let things kind of accrue over time because people just aren't thinking, they don't have the time to think about it. They're trying to just do their job, which I think is totally understandable and worth remembering. I mean, I think what I was talking about in terms of just getting onto a rhythm doesn't have to be particularly arduous. So like we have the first workshop that I will often run with organizations, I'm doing one with the DAO tomorrow, is we essentially get together and we put a blank OS canvas on the table in front of us. And we just talk through like, what is the current reality? And we go through field by field. So purpose, like, do we have one? Do we feel like we need one? Like, well, how are we using the idea of purpose? Then we go to the next one. All right, meetings. What are meetings like here? Are they good? Are they bad? Like, how do we feel about that? membership, mastery, compensation. We just talk through it all to get a bit of a sense of where the tensions are. And then we talk about, all right, well, so this tension that popped up, or this field that seems to have like 10 tensions in it versus this one that has none. Let's talk about what we could do here. And then we're talking about practices that may address those tensions. I'm bringing stuff in from my experience of, the various case studies, a lot of these self-managing organizations that have figured out how to do these various things, bringing these as examples. And then we pick one that looks like it'll work, and we design an experiment that is specifically designed for their context. Like, all right, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to try this. Or, two of us are going to go off and design a thing that we think will be useful. We'll bring it back in 2 weeks and we'll actually try it. Something like that. And I mean, you can do that in 90 minutes and have a really productive session. And if you do that every 2 months, you're not going to suddenly show up and be like, oh my God, this tension that we've never seen or we've never talked about is suddenly like consuming everything. At least in my experience, usually tensions that become a big deal were first small deals at first. And if you've been talking about them along the way, it's not surprising if it becomes kind of a big deal. But if you never talk about it, then when it shows up, when we finally do come together, or if something does just kind of pop off as particularly broken, it can feel, you can get very easily kind of get out of control. Like, oh my God, like how did we let it get this bad? Well, we have to take major action because we have a major problem. And having to take major action is high risk. We often talk about a saying that I try to put in people's minds is, what does it look like to do something radical at a non-radical scale? Like that is the basis of a good experiment. Trying to do something radical at a radical scale, you're going to have a bad time. And if you're at a point where you only look at your tensions once a year or never, or only when it really hurts, your impulse is going to be to do something radical at a radical scale. And that's a rough spot to be in.
So Sam, you kind of mentioned organizational OS about twice. So for the audience who don't know about organizational OS, can you just like briefly touch upon it and give us like some understanding of what it is exactly?
Sure.
That OS canvas, the OS canvas that you said. Imagine that the listeners are your prospects now, and you're just going to bring that whole canvas to them. Just walk us through what it would be like.
So when I say operating system or organizational operating system, we're just using it as an analogy or a metaphor. So if you think about a computer, your phone, whatever, it has an operating system, right? But generally, for most people, you're not interacting directly with the code that makes up the operating system. What you're interacting with is everything that rides on top of the operating system. And the operating system is this kind of this hidden layer that has that has rules and everything baked into it that affects what you actually do interact with. So let's think about that at an organizational level. So if we have an organizational operating system, what is the kind of hidden layer that everything we do interact with, the experience of working in or interacting with an organization, what are those things? And we would argue they are principles, they are practices, they are assumptions about certain things. And those certain things are what we would call the operating system canvas, which are 12 different fields. And all these fields are just parts of an organization where you have assumptions, where you have principles, where you have practices. And I'll just rattle through them real quick. I'm looking over my left shoulder because I actually have it taped to my wall because I think it's just like nice decor, but also is useful to make sure I don't miss anything. So from the top left, purpose, strategy, workflow, membership. So purpose, how we use purpose to steer and make decisions. Strategy, I probably don't need to define each of these. Membership is maybe one that is surprising to hear, but it's basically just how do we cultivate relationships in our organization? What does it mean to be a member? Next row down, authority, resources, meetings, and mastery. And then the last row is structure, innovation, information, compensation. So when I talk about that exercise where we just get together and we try to understand our operating system, that's the artifact that I'm putting in front of people. And we're going through and talking about, what are the tensions that potentially exist here. And when you do that with a team, one is that you quickly realize that a tension can often go in multiple boxes. Like we think it's a communication tension, but then we start talking about it a little bit more and we realize actually it's really an authority thing. Like we don't have clear authority, so therefore it's manifesting as a communication problem. So I think just doing that more regularly builds a team's ability to talk about things that are going on in a non-emotional way. I think it's actually a key thing. It can be hard for a first time to talk about tensions that exist in an operating system because it feels like a failure, especially if you're in a position of leadership in that organization. So I really work hard with teams to try to just make this. We're not condemning anyone. We're not shaming anyone. We're just trying to understand what's going on in this very complex system. And as we get better at talking about it, we can get better at potentially solving for it, which is why we've created those tension cards that I mentioned before, because something we discovered very early on is that it was actually really hard for people to put words to what they were feeling about their organization. But if you put these cards in front of people, then they can just read the card, and it seems to be easier for them to make a connection to the feeling that they're actually having. They can be like, oh yeah, like that is definitely something that we have. That is definitely something we have. And this one is definitely something we have. But over time, people need the cards less. They're able to articulate what's going on for them in a organizational kind of context. So that's the operating system. I guess, what did I not cover maybe that you think folks would want to know more about?
No, I think that in general, what you have there is a very vast way to understand organizational design as a whole. The entire variables, you have it there in a way that's easy for your prospects to kind of understand exactly where to pinpoint what, and that's pretty phenomenal. And having this done in 2 months, every 2 months itself, it's a fantastic way for communities to just kind of wrap it up. Amazing. What I want to understand here is, and you've done a lot of these how do I put it, workshops with these DAOs, where exactly do you see the major problems stemming from that issues? Where are the major tensions that you've kind of seen within that, and why has that happened?
Yeah, I think the most common fields of the canvas where I have done work with DAOs, I'm just looking over my shoulder here if my voice is changing. Purpose, strategy are two for sure. They often are very, very connected. I actually have not done a lot of meetings stuff. I would say primarily purpose, strategy, and authority are kind of the three where we've done the most work. I'm happy to go into detail about any of those, but that is actually a little bit different than my traditional client work, which I'm still doing traditional client work, and that very commonly starts in the workflow meetings and information column of the canvas. And I'll have to think more about why that difference exists. I think probably, traditional organization are generally their purpose is pretty well articulated. It may not be a useful thing. Like people may not be using the purpose the way that we would want them to use it, but it's there and it doesn't really feel like it can change. Whereas, DAOs, there is so many degrees of freedom with what is happening within DAOs and within their org design. I think kind of coalescing around a purpose feels kind of top of mind for a lot of them if they haven't yet already done that.
Not to mention, DAOs are very nascent. I mean, Gitcoin DAO, which we'll get into pretty soon also, by the way, just a year in existence, and the way, as you aptly mentioned, there's always going to be major tensions around authority, around purpose, because the community is constantly evolving. It's not like the trad world where the people are going to be sticking around for a decent period of time. The purpose has been there since a couple of years. All you're doing is working to ensure that a more of a horizontal growth approach towards that purpose. You're not going to see a radical shift in that entire purpose. But within DAOs, because you're so nascent, you're struggling to find that sort of product market fit. You're struggling to kind of cater to what's needed in the community. Within a month, the entire NFT space is going to be completely different. Tokens are just going to, the way you see tokens are just going to be radically shift. And all these DAOs are just kind of struggling to be relevant on a monthly basis. So, and not to mention, so it's dealing with all these externalities that, purpose, strategy, and the broad, authority will always be a massive tension. It's pretty neat that way.
Yeah.
I hope you all enjoyed part 2 of this episode. We will now head into the cream of his DAO work that he's done with Gitcoin DAO. Gitcoin DAO, what were the issues that Gitcoin DAO faced in general that allowed for his the scope of work that he had done, how he landed the gig there in the first place, what were some of the key tension points that the DAO kind of faced, and how to facilitate that sort of tough convos. And we also get into the challenges that DAOs face while developing that sort of essential intent and how to solve that, and of course trivia organizational design questions. So do stay tuned for that one. It'll be a baller part 3 that we are going to get head into. Have a great day ahead.